We don't think about ancient Kemet. We don't even learn about Kemet. There's so many things that happen in ancient Kemet, happen in Africa, and happen in various places around the world. We just don't learn about them, right? Maybe someplace else in the world, but a lot of people and a lot of people here in the United States and America and various places around the world do not learn about these things and are not put forth. So I wanted to kind of take some time and talk about that. And as I get started, before I get started, I want to thank you for those of you who've been asking and talking about or reading my books or just interacting with that. I have very much appreciated that. They're available on Amazon. I want to mention that I have Religion of the Black Land, which is a new book that I've written, the newest book that I've written, that talks about Kemetic and Kushite religious theology from the standpoint of the documents that they wrote. So whether it's the teachings of Ptah Hotep or the Asarian Tell or the 42 Declarations of Innocence or the Victory Stele of King Pianki, these documents are discussed in this new book, Religion of the Black Land. I also have stories about Black history by Anita Smith, as well as 10 things your child should know about reading, writing, and math, giving you kind of an idea of various things that might be important to you to want to know, to either teach yourself or to share with yourself or to share with your children. So wanted to share that, from 10 things your child should know to stories about Black history and religion of the Black Land. So thank you so much for those who've been asking and been reading and purchasing it. I very much appreciate that. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit. I wanted to kind of go just kind of quickly and talk a little bit about legal documents, because as I think about ancient Kemet and I think about just the idea of legal organization, a lot of times when I hear about legality and the law and following rules, a lot of times, what we hear about is the Code of Hammurabi, and there's nothing wrong with it. The Code of Hammurabi was written probably in around 1750 or so, or thereabouts, BC. So you maybe 1754, maybe a little bit earlier than that, BC. So that will correspond to the time in ancient Kemetic history, like right around the time when the Hyksos were ruling, or just before that, and as you started to approach the New Kingdom, but before the New Kingdom. That would correspond to around that time. And a lot of times when we think about that, we're just told about that. But if you stop and just think, kind of put on your critical thinking cap and you start to think about societies all around the world, even 1700 BC, people were all around the world. People were doing all kinds of things all around the world. And in ancient Kemet, by 1700 to 1750 BC, the pyramids were old. They were hundreds of years old by that time, literally hundreds of years old. I mean, even America isn't as old as the pyramids were at the time that the Code of Hammurabi was written. The pyramids were older than that. They were hundreds of years old, many hundreds of years old. And so when we start to think about that, you understand that you start to put it on a critical thinking gap, and you start to think, there was amazing things they were doing. If you just stop and think about the sheer task of what they were doing, the amount of workforce and organization it took to bring thousands of people together, probably tens of thousands of people over a period of time, over years, to build the massive structures, not just the pyramids, not just one, two, or three, but many pyramids, temples. We're not even talking about temples that were also built at the same time, or palaces, or the agricultural work that was done. There's one thing that was done in ancient Kemet that was done from the Old Kingdom. You can find that they had like a census view, or they had a counting of the resources in ancient Kemet, the accounting of cattle, accounting of small cattle, large cattle. You would see that talked about, documented on a Palermo stone, going way back in the early history of ancient Kemet. You're talking like 3,000 years before Christ, the early in the way history of ancient Kemet, talking about basically doing a census. Another thing they did a lot of times in ancient Kemet was that they measured the Nile. So you will see that from an early part in ancient Kemet, going all the way down through almost this entire history. You can go through the New Kingdom in the late period. You see the Kushite kings doing that as they ruled Kemet. They are measuring the Nile, because obviously the flow of the Nile and the height of the Nile has so much to do with whether or not you're going to have a good agricultural season, whether or not you're going to be able to serve up food, whether or not there was going to be disruption in the land, whether or not you were going to be able to travel and transport goods up and down, and basically eat, which is the main point of it. So you start to have a significant understanding that the ancient Kemetic people, we're doing a lot when it comes to organizations, and even like a census. Even though it wasn't quite like a census where they counted every person in the land, they were doing census-like work, and that they were counting resources. So counting the amount of cattle that they had, small cattle and large cattle, kind of categorizing them and using these documents. So from a Kemetic standpoint, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the political organization in ancient Kemet, from a Kemetic standpoint, they are talking about, they have various visors, they have various officials who are ruling and doing various things. So you may have someone who's in charge of a certain segment of Kemet. So you may have somebody who's in charge of the northern part of Kemet, and somebody's in charge of the southern part of Kemet at various times in its history, right? So it's going to be slightly different organized in that way. And you're going to have within them, you may have different districts. And a lot of times people will call them nomes after kind of a Greek concept of a district. But you would have districts or provinces. Think of them like states. Think of them almost like a state, a province, an area where there was a local ruler, a governor of the area, and there were many small towns in that province, right? And it may have been a central town that was a center of that province, but it was a part of a larger province, and that was what we call today nomes, right? So you had people who were local rulers, sometimes deified, sometimes in a kind of a royal kind of structure, who were over zones that they literally cover. And then you had people who they may have reported to, in the sense that there may have been people assigned by the king to oversee this entire area and all these norms. And let me know what's happening in terms of the cattle. Let me know what's happening in terms of the Nile. Let me know what's happening in terms of the taxes you collect, the things you're collecting them. Let me know how we're feeding in our resources to our temples, how we're feeding in those resources to the overall treasury of the entire country. That's your job. And that person might have also had military responsibilities in addition to that. So they were doing a lot. So your job is really to make sure you understand and know and collect and can account for the taxes and the resources in the area that you control. And you have a large area that you're controlling, and you are to report that in on a regular basis to the king so they could know what was happening in their land. That was pretty far out. I mean, you're going up and down the Nile for miles and miles. You have to really know what's going on. So there's a level of organization and structure there. And sometimes we like to, when we think about legal documents, we do this in a Western way. Whenever we think about who was the first to do this, we always want to say somebody's the first. And usually the people we say are the first are not the first, right? Even when we talk about ancient Kemet, there are many things that they did that other people did before them. I mean, the people in the Nile Valley go back thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years before Kemet is even a country. So you can't even say they were the first people in the Nile Valley to do this. They're just the first people in Nile Valley that we recognize who did that, and they were significant. So I love the culture. I love talking about them. They were significant, but I'm saying that history goes beyond the lines in the sand that we draw. And one of the lines in the sand that we draw comes to legal documents. We talk about writing, and we talk about legality, and we talk a lot about the Code of Hammurabi. And Hammurabi, was a significant ruler in Babylon and in Babylonia, and his code, the code that's attributed to him under his rule, that's a significant code. That's not a bad thing. That's a significant code that he had written, that he had posted, that there were, things that people did that if they violated that, they would be punished in some type of way. So people look at that as being the first code or the first written code that we know of, right? But as you start to think about it, and you think about legality and that line in the sand that we've drawn, you can go back and you can see things in ancient Kemet. We've just talked about how organized they were just to build the pyramids and to build the magnificent things that they did, and the scale that they did it on. We think about just the scale of that in terms of, you're talking about massive amounts of people, massive amounts of resources. People get hurt. So there's a need for medical types of things. People are going to get mad at one another and accuse one another. So the idea of coming before a court. So think about ancient Kemet. The whole idea of Ma'at is you are coming before and you're having your heart judged on a scale, and you're being judged. You're coming before a hall where a judgment is taking place. If you think about the Asarian Tell, they talk about Set being kind of put on trial before a tribunal, and people are determining whether or not he is guilty or not guilty. That you have people who can bring an accusation against a neighbor, and that has to be heard by somebody. And a lot of times that person who was set over either Upper Kemet or Lower Kemet, the northern part of Kemet and Lower, or the southern part of Kemet and Upper Kemet, that person who sat over there, who was like the official, if you will, also heard grievances. They also heard grievances. So, and we're going to talk more about that whole role more in detail, but there are things and instructions that are given. Even the teachings of Ptah, they talk about him as if he's a visor. And some of the other instructionary things that are written down in ancient Kemet, they talk about giving instructions to a young person who might be taking on the role of a judge, or taking on the role of a visor, or a king who's going to hear disputes that happen in the land. So those things happen, and that king has to make a decision and a judgment, what's right and what's wrong. And that judgment has to be based on something, right? And so whether it looked exactly like the way we want to make it look, or whether it looked like, something else, the Code of Hammurabi, those judgments had to be made, right? And so the idea of legality in a country writing down things and having documents that are legal agreements or laws becomes something that goes beyond 1700 BC, right? It goes beyond 1750 BC. And as I share some things from ancient Kemet, I want to just talk a little bit about one of the things that you can find, even in the 4th dynasty and the 5th dynasty, you will find a lot of tombs and mastabas. And we talked about mastabas yesterday, these kind of rectangular sloped buildings that were used as tombs, but very popular as tombs just before they started building pyramids for the kings and queens and things of that nature. But people might build these mastabas or just certain types of tombs for their family members, and they would document it. So one of the types of documentations that they did was, this is right here these are people from the 4th and 5th dynasty of ancient Kemet, and these are people saying that, this was done, this particular tomb was made by a person's eldest son, the person who was a mortuary piece and a scribe. And he said, I came that I might do this for him when he was buried in the beautiful West, according to that which he spoke about while he was alive upon his 2 feet. And it talks about one whose son shall do for him when he is in the West. And he's talking about Ifi or Iki. He said, I did this for my father when he journeyed to the West upon the beautiful ways, upon the revered dear journey. And then this is talking about a son who's going to do this and build, and who is the son of a person who's an overseer of the pyramid. So this right here is directly referring to Ka-Re, right? By his son, the overseer of the pyramid, greatest Ka-Re, the king's confidant, Teddy, who made this for his father and his mother when they were both buried in the Western Highlands. And so he's talking about here a person who is the son of a person who was an overseer and is taking care of the pyramid, the great pyramid of Ka-Re. So it's got to be somewhere around the time, or somewhere around in the 4th or 5th dynasty, because the pyramid would have still been there, and building this tomb for his mother and father. So as you start to think about that, this person is putting forth a testament of what I'm doing and how I'm building something for my mother and my father. And I want it to be known that they're going on to the beautiful West. They're going on to the place of rest. And I want to know that their son, that their child did this for them. And I want that to be the case. So as you start to document, passing on your tomb and building a tomb for a family member, you start to see, there are a lot of things that could happen, that legally might need to be addressed, right? Might need to be addressed. So that what if somebody damaged that tomb in some way? What if somebody took the offerings from that tomb? What if somebody wanted to one day in the future take over the space of that tomb because they thought they had a right to it for some reason? Now you get to the point, whenever you have an organized society, as organized as ancient Kemet was, you're going to have challenges. You're going to have accusations. You're going to have just disputes that arise, and you have to have some kind of way to address it. So whether or not it was a legal code in the way we think about it, there's some things that we can think about that we have documentation of when it comes to legal documents. And so this right here is the will of Prince Nakure. Now he is the son of Ka-Re. So this would have been written sometime around 2500 BC or thereabouts, or a little later than that. So this would have been written before the Code of Hammurabi, right? So even though that was a different type of legal document, this would have been a legal document. So this would have been written some 800 years or so before the Code of Hammurabi, or something of that nature, hundreds of years before that. And this is a son, as I mentioned, of King Ka-Re, who was the builder of the second Great Pyramid, right? So he's the builder and probably the person who the Sphinx is made after, right? So this is his son. And his son is leaving a will, and his son is talking about in his will that he's leaving it. And he names several people, several of them who are his children, that he's going to leave different information to. So that they mention right up at the very beginning of this, that this is the year of the 12th occurrence of the numbering of large and small cattle. As I mentioned to you just a little while ago, there was a period of time in ancient Kemetic history where they numbered on a regular basis. At one point in time it was every 2 years, and then it went to be every year. They numbered on a regular basis how many cattle they had and various resources that were important to the entire country. So they sometimes marked their legal documents as well as some of their eventual documents, their annals, if you will, of things that the king did. Sometimes they marked it by the time of this occurrence of the counting, the numbering that took place. It took place during the 12th numbering or the 10th numbering or the first numbering, whatever it might be. Sometimes they framed up their time in that way. And then they began also to frame it up just in terms of the time of the kings themselves and when the kings ruled. But you can see this clearly mentioned, that year, the 12th occurrence of the numbering of small and large cattle which becomes probably kind of a legal thing that you have to do, right? If you don't do it, you probably get in trouble. If you are an official who's called upon to count the resources in your area, you don't do it, you're probably going to there's probably a consequence for that. And so it becomes kind of a legal thing that you're doing as a political entity. You're engaging in this, kind of like a census taking of your resources, right? Numbering of it. And so he talks about the king's son. This is a son of Khafre. And he's talking about that while he's living upon his 2 feet without ailing in any respect. So the person who translates this, talks about this person making this statement. And in several of these legal documents, they talk about, I'm making this statement. I'm doing this while I'm alive, while I'm upon my 2 feet. And he adds the part, while I'm not feeling any type of ailment in my body in any respect. Interesting. So I don't know. I cannot say that the idea that we say in our wills, I being of sound mind and body do hereby declare, if that came from Egypt. I don't know if that came from ancient Kemet. All I'm saying is that the person who's translating this attests that this is what they're saying, that the person, Khafre's son, is saying some 2,500 years before Christ, some hundreds of years before the Code of Hammurabi, I am making this following command while I'm living upon his 2 feet and without any respect of ailment in his body. And that sounds very similar to me, the things that we've done. So maybe we inherited from them. I don't know, but that's interesting that it's translated that way. And so he talks on, that he's giving towns, and many of the towns are named after Khafre. This guy is Khafre's son, and Khafre would have been very powerful, obviously, in the wake of your dad's being king and having the second great pyramid built. He would have been very powerful. So a lot of the towns that were at and around and near the pyramid whole complex, some of those towns were belonged to the king or belonged to his family and his sons, and some of those towns were giving away for various reasons. So his son is talking about that he's giving it not only to his family members, but he also is giving it, to one of his sons. So he's giving like the eastern land. He's the king's confidant. He's giving part of the land to one of his sons or one of his children. He's the king's confidant. And he's also talking about that his daughter, the king's confidant, Hetepheres, that he's giving her a district, and the town is called Khafre. A lot of the towns were called Khafre because this would have been near the time that he was alive. And so he's giving something to his daughter, and he talks about giving it to his son, other members of his family, he's bequeathing to them ownership of land. So this is a legal document. This would have been a document that people would have been required to respect in ancient Kemet. And as we talk about, as I mentioned, we talk about legal documents and things like that. A lot of times you hear people talk about this history and they only talk about the Code of Hammurabi. We put history in a box. We don't talk about the wills from ancient Kemet that are hundreds of years older than the Code of Hammurabi. That would have been legal documents. We don't talk about the contracts, which we'll talk about in a minute, or the endowments that they entered into, or some of the legal requirements like the numberings that they did and things that they put in place. We don't talk about that. I think we limit it for various reasons. We want to take history and shape it in a way that's comfortable for us. And we limit. To me, I believe all of human history is history. I don't think you got to draw a line in the sand. And I don't think that ancient Kemet, just because it started some 3,100, 3,400 years, whatever, before Christ, that's when things started in Northeast Africa, that's when things start. That's ridiculous. That didn't happen. It's just absolutely ridiculous. We have to have a broader view of history to understand that all of human history is history. And we like to also, another example of that, we like to also talk about medicine, for example. We'll say the Hippocratic Oaths and talk about Hippocrates, and we'll talk about him and being the father of medicine. But we have documents in ancient Kemet that are years and years older than Hippocrates himself that were medical, that were logical and medical. I talked about, how they talked about setting bones and the breaking of bones and how do you handle injuries, medical documents. But yet we call somebody from another part of the world, a European, the father of medicine, and sometimes they'll say the father of modern medicine or just the father of medicine, but that's just, it's not the case, right? We like to just draw these lines and ways instead of opening up and say, when did these things happen? And any part of human history is history. So I wanted to kind of point that out as we think about legal documents, right? So here is a will from Khafre's son that's 2,500 years before Christ, 4,500 years ago, and he's leaving resources to his children, and he's also leaving it to his wife. Talks about his beloved wife and the part of the town called Beautiful is Khafre that he's leaving to her because, he's the king's son, so he probably has a lot of resources. So this becomes a document, 2,500 years before Christ, 4,500 years ago, where he's leaving resources in a legal document to his family in a will. And as I mentioned, as we think about the Code of Hammurabi, he ruled from about 1792 to about 1750 BC. So even though we point to this as being the first legal code, if you will, that does not mean that's written, that was published, right? We have to put all these qualifiers around. It does not mean that people were not practicing law or doing legal things or going about things in a way that there were rules and consequences for those rules if they were broken in other parts of the world. So it could have been, you could have been in Sumeria, you could have been in North America, in Central America or South America. You could have been in what is today, China. You could have been all over those places and have organized societies that had consequences for the things they did. And we just sometimes pick and choose, and we just sometimes pick a time, right, that's beneficial. And it always seems that we skip over places like Egypt. We can skip over places like Kemet, who has such a record where you find so many things that we do now that we consider modern, that we do, that they were already practicing very early forms of, and probably they were practicing in ways where other people may have been doing it before them, and they just inherited it from people who were already there, who may have done it a long time ago. Because I can't imagine any society acting together for any long period of time and there not being rules. However rural that society is, they probably had rules. And so it allows us to open up our mind and know that there are bigger parts of the world that we should look at, and not just look at a very narrow part of that. If we talk about our alphabet, if we talk about, writing system, if we talk about language, where was the first language spoken? When did people first develop language? That's many thousands of years ago, that tens of thousands of years ago, and probably in Africa. That's what the scientists say. It probably happened in Africa. We don't even talk about that and expand our mind to that. So this is the Code of Hammurabi, like 1792 to 1750. And I wanted to share this also too. This is also a testament. This is an enactment of a gentleman, an unknown official living around the time of Khafre. And he's talking about, this is another legal document. He's establishing an endowment for his tomb. As I mentioned, the ancient Kemetic people did so many things for religious reasons, so many things because of the way they believed, the way they looked at God, how they respected their family. You can see that, and it touched every form of life. It touched whether it was legal matters, whether it was medical matters, whether it was, passing on inheritance, whether it was, religious matters, whether it was school matters. It touched so many areas, every area of their life, really. You can find that, but it touches on some type of moral kind of consequence and moral code that goes along with it. Really a moral code, right? That's really what it is, a moral code, right? That you're supposed to live by. So this right here is this man who has an endowment and is by the tomb, near the tomb of Khafre. So this would have been near the pyramid right here near the pyramid of Khafre. This guy has towns. He has an endowment. He's setting up a set of money, a large set of resources to be dedicated to him for his tomb, so that people can come offer to him and that his offerings would be made forever. And we were talking about that yesterday, about how that was such an important part, the importance of a Kemetic tomb. And here you're going to see this in a legal document, not just in a religious document, which is significant, but in a legal document. And as this is translated by Breslin, it talks about that the legal organization of this remote age, right? That this gives you an idea of the economic importance of it and the organization around the legal structure in ancient Kemet as it relates to this person's endowment and what they were leaving for their tomb. So, and his will, right? It's kind of like his will, but it's a little deeper than will, because he's actually listing resources that will be used in his benefit after he dies to maintain his tomb and to maintain the offerings that would take care of his tomb. And so as I jump into it and talk about, he talks about, again, while living on his 2 feet, even a sole companion, Lord of Nectin, which is in the farther south in ancient Kemet, that he is a member of the king's court, and that he's a governor, right? And he's praised of Hu, first of heaven. These are his mortuary priests. And he's having a contract that literally sets up priests who are going to be contracted into perpetuity to take care of his offerings, to get food, to get resources according to the festivals and the feasts and the ceremonies that were supposed to be done to keep a person's spirit alive after the afterlife. You did a contract with a priest. This is a legal document that you entered in with a priest. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's something interesting to think about. And he says, I make this decree, that I've not empowered the people who I'm giving this to, whether it's my brothers or my daughters or my sisters or the people who are part of my mortuary priest, the priesthood that I'm contracting with. I haven't empowered them to do anything, or anybody that's related to them to do anything with the resources I'm about to give them, other than give me my offerings. I'm not giving them permission to take my inheritance. And this is literally a legal document of a person saying, you know what, I'm having a will and I'm going to contract with these people who are priests, and you have my permission to only do these things with it. And then what are the consequences if you don't, is laid out in the document as well. So he said, you don't have anything to do. You can't do anything with the resources I'm about to give you. And I'm going to lay them what they are, other than what I've said, which is to take care of my offerings and my tomb. So it talks about his tomb is going to be eternal. This was an idea of into perpetuity, and it was going to be by the pyramid, greatest Khafre. So as you start to think about that, God bless you. So, all right. Yes, I know, King Scam. Yeah, that is, you see a lot of that in the ancient records. You do see a lot of that, and there's so many records out there to read. It's good when you start to just read the records one by one, for those who have time, because some people don't have time. When you start to read the records, it begins to open your eyes. And I really believe in looking at a lot of different resources and doing it as our ancestors do it. Use the energy and the insight you have in yourself as you start to read these things, just like you read anything in history, just like you read anything in school. As you start to examine these things for yourself, what is your understanding of it? What insight do you give to it? What insight do you get from it, right? And that's what it's all about. That's anything you do, whether you are practicing religion, whether you are practicing law, medicine, basketball, whatever you may be practicing, you're going to put your own insight into it. And that's what makes it special, and that's what makes it interesting. So I wish that everybody would be reading and sharing these resources and being able to kind of jump into it. So he is talking about, he's not empowering the mortuary priest to do anything, to give lands or people or any other resources as he's setting aside for his offerings, for his tomb after he dies, that they cannot give it to anybody, that they can't do anything other than for it, but to use it for his offerings, that he's not empowering them to give the lands or to give it to anybody or entitling them to divide it up with anybody but the mortuary priests who are among that sect of priests that he's doing this contract with. And he mentions, so you have a group of priests that are going to be performing this, and these resources, and we're talking about lands here. It's interesting because as a part of this legal document, it talks about Khafre giving this official an entire town, which is interesting, an entire area where the people are there. He's giving us it, and people will raise food. They will raise resources from this town to go to your benefit for when you die. Think about that. That means ancient Kemetic people were serious about this whole afterlife. They were very serious about the whole idea of a person's tomb and taking care of them in the afterlife. The whole entire town was dedicated for this man to be able to provide resources for him in the afterlife. And he was given that by Khafre, by the king of the land. So he must have been an official that he liked, right? And he talks about that if anybody violates that, that they're going to be, that if they violate the terms of this, let's say they give away his land or his resources to somebody else or to a member of their, or in a way that's not appropriate, then they will lose their portion of it, because obviously the priests also benefited in some kind of way being contracted to do this. They were also getting paid. They would lose their possession and their portion of the possessions that this official was giving them in order so that they would do his offering. So this becomes an interesting thing. And he talks about suits and it talks about endowments, so that if there's a situation where one priest is sued by another priest, or somebody comes and sues a priest who's a part of my mortuary endowment, that whatever the resources or the resolution is, it can't involve my resources. It can't involve my offerings. It can't involve my town. So here you have evidence of a man who basically obviously knew King Khafre some 2,500 years before Christ, writing out a legal document, essentially a contract, and stating out the terms of that contract with priests who are going to administer to his tomb and provide offerings for him and do ceremonies into perpetuity, and how that would pass on to their children and to the mortuary priests who were part of his sect. And it couldn't go outside of that. So when you start to think about this is a legal document. This is a legal way of approaching. These are consequences and things that are laid out and resources that are laid out in a very legal way. So as we start to think about Kemetic legal documents, or we start to think about just the practice of law, or just the idea of people developing laws under which they ruled, and developing contracts, sophisticated contracts, I think we got to look at ancient Kemet. We cannot have this conversation where we just skip over. When we think about the alphabet and we think about writing, a lot of times they will kind of mention ancient Kemet, but then skip over and talk about somebody else. When they think about law, they skip over hundreds of years of legal documents in ancient Kemet and go straight to the Code of Hammurabi and never mention these things that I just shared with you now. So I asked you to take a look at it, and I saw some things in the comments. If you have comments and things that you're sharing, things that you know about that we should share and that we should talk about, let me know. Let's include it on it. If you have additional legal documents, because I'm going to be talking about more and more things that show more consequences with respect to legality and legal documents from ancient Kemet. I'm going to be talking about that, but please share it down below, and let's tell somebody when we talk about legality and the law and legal history that we should be thinking about this place in Africa. We should be thinking about ancient Kemet and other societies that did these things long before some of the other things that we talk about, like the Code of Hammurabi. So thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much. God bless you. And I appreciate you sharing this with somebody.